There is a door in the basement of the Palazzo della Ragione in Padua, Italy, that has been bricked over since 1420. The city government sealed it during a renovation. They left no record of what was behind it. For 600 years, no official has ordered it reopened. Historians know it exists. The bricks are clearly newer than the surrounding stone. Nobody has explained why it was sealed, and nobody in authority has asked. That silence is what this video is about. Not the door, the silence. Every major civic building erected before 1700 contains at least one architectural feature that has been quietly removed from public access over the past 3 centuries. Not destroyed, not filled, sealed. The difference is meaningful, and it is the first thing you need to understand before anything else in this video makes sense. When something is destroyed, it is gone. When something is sealed, it is preserved, and the decision to preserve it rather than remove it tells you that whoever sealed it understood its value. You do not brick over a doorway if what is behind it is worthless. You brick it over precisely because what is behind it is not worthless. This is not a claim about secret rooms or hidden treasure. This is a claim about economics. Specifically, it is a claim about the deliberate restructuring of public space that occurred in parallel with the centralization of European finance between 1600 and 1850, and how that restructuring left physical evidence in stone that most people walk past every day without recognizing what they are seeing. The economic history you were taught has a geography problem. It describes the rise of modern banking, the emergence of central credit systems, the consolidation of trade routes, all as if these were purely institutional events. As if they happened in documents and ledgers and meeting rooms. They did not. They happened in buildings. Specific buildings with specific rooms, some of which are no longer accessible. Before the construction of the first permanent stock exchanges and banking houses in the 16th century, the primary economic infrastructure of every European city was its public hall. The word in Italian is Palazzo Pubblico. In German it is Rathaus. In English it became the Guildhall. These buildings were not administrative offices in the modern sense. They were the physical location where economic activity was conducted, witnessed, and recorded. The trading floor of a medieval city was not a metaphor. It was a room in a building that still stands. What happened inside those rooms was different from what we now call commerce. Transactions required witnesses from multiple guilds. Prices were announced publicly and recorded on surfaces visible to anyone present. Weights and measures were kept in standardized sets that any merchant could consult and verify. The physical architecture enforced transparency in a way that no modern regulatory body has replicated. You could not conduct a transaction in secret because the transaction took place in a public hall, surrounded by guild representatives whose legal status depended on their presence. The Cloth Hall of Ypres, completed in 1304, had an open ground floor 240 feet long. That floor was not decorative, it was functional infrastructure. Merchants displayed goods on both sides, while any citizen could walk through the centre and observe what was being traded at what price. The building was not a market in the sense of a place where commerce happened to occur. It was a machine for making commerce legible, and legibility was the point. That model required physical space, a lot of it. The open galleries, the witness chambers, the measure rooms, the scale rooms, the dispute halls, all of it took up square footage that could theoretically be used for other things. When the economic system began to shift in the 16th century, these spaces did not disappear immediately. They were repurposed, subdivided, or sealed. Historians of architecture have documented what they call the progressive privatization of the ground floor in European civic buildings between 1550 and 1750. Before 1550, the ground floors of major public halls were predominantly open to foot traffic. By 1750, the majority of that ground floor access in the same buildings had been converted to lockable rooms administered by private guilds or municipal banking offices. The physical transition happened incrementally, renovation by renovation, so that no single change looked significant. But the cumulative effect was the replacement of an open public trading infrastructure with a controlled access system. The sealed chambers are what remained after that process was complete. Here is a specific example that received almost no attention outside German architectural history. The Altes Rathaus in Munich contains a set of chambers in its northeast corner that were recorded in an 1802 survey as the measurement archives, rooms where certified standards of weight and length were stored and publicly accessible for verification. The 1802 survey noted that access had been restricted by order of the city council at a date the surveyor could not determine, but which, based on the lock hardware, appeared to be sometime in the mid-17th century. The chambers appear in no subsequent official record as either open or destroyed. They were simply no longer mentioned. When a restoration team documented the building in 1987, they found the same chambers still sealed with the original measurement standards reportedly still inside. The standards were not removed, the access was. What made measurement standards worth sealing? The answer is that whoever controlled the physical standards controlled the definition of value. If the authoritative weights and measures were publicly accessible and independently verifiable, then any merchant could challenge a transaction by requesting a measurement. That right of challenge was a structural constraint on pricing power. Remove the public access, and you remove the challenge mechanism without having to formally abolish it. You do not have to believe in a coordinated conspiracy to understand how this worked. You only have to understand institutional incentives. Any private banking operation that gained control of the measurement archive in a given city gained a structural advantage in every transaction conducted in that city. The incentive to convert public access into restricted access was enormous, and it operated continuously across every city in Europe for 200 years. The pattern is visible in the buildings if you know what you are looking for. Go to any major civic structure built before 1600 and examine the ground floor plan, then compare it to the ground floor as it currently exists. In virtually every case, you will find that spaces which appear in pre-1700 records as public rooms appear in post-1800 records, either as private offices, storage areas, or not at all. The terminology changes. The public measurement room becomes the archive. The witness chamber becomes the records office. The open trading gallery becomes the administrative corridor. In each case, the function shifts from public legibility to institutional control, and the architectural evidence of the original function is sealed rather than removed because removal would require explanation. Sealing requires no explanation. A bricked doorway is just a bricked doorway until someone asks why. This becomes economically significant when you trace what happened to price formation during the same period. One of the most consistent findings in the revisionist economic history of the past 30 years is that price volatility in European markets increased substantially between 1600 and 1800, precisely during the period when the public trading infrastructure was being enclosed. The orthodox explanation for this volatility is that it reflects the natural turbulence of emerging markets. But there is an alternative interpretation that the data also supports. Prices became more volatile because the mechanisms that had enforced price transparency were being systematically privatized, and private price formation is inherently less stable than public price formation because it depends on information asymmetries that compound over time. The sealed rooms are physical evidence of that transition. They are not dramatic. They do not look like evidence of anything. They look like old brickwork and locked doors and storage areas behind railings with polite signs asking visitors not to enter. But what they represent is the moment when the economic infrastructure of a community stopped being a public resource and became a private asset, and the community was not asked whether it approved of the change. The reason these spaces were sealed rather than repurposed is worth considering carefully. If the private interests that gained control of measurement archives and witness chambers had simply converted those spaces to commercial offices, they would have invited questions about what had been there before and why it no longer served its original function. Sealing the spaces preserved the original function in amber, inaccessible but intact, while removing it from public use. It was a legal and architectural strategy. The building's original function could not be claimed to have been abolished because it had not been. It had merely been made inaccessible. The distinction was juridically important in a period when customary rights were still legally enforceable, and removing a customary right was more legally precarious than simply preventing its exercise. Merchants who had the customary right to verify weights in the public measurement room retained that right in principle. They simply could not exercise it because the room was sealed. If they complained, they were told the room was under restoration, or that access required advance arrangement, or that the relevant official was unavailable. The right existed. The access did not. After a generation, the right was forgotten along with the practice, and when the right was eventually formally abolished in law, nobody objected because nobody remembered what they had lost. That is the mechanism, not a dramatic conspiracy with a villain and a plan. A slow administrative, architectural erosion of public economic infrastructure, conducted renovation by renovation, door by door, brick by brick, across 2 centuries. There are approximately 4,000 major civic buildings in Europe that predate 1700 and remain structurally intact. Of those, architectural surveys conducted between 1950 and 2010 have identified sealed interior spaces in roughly 60%. Not all of those spaces have economic significance. Some are structural voids, some are the result of ordinary maintenance decisions, but a substantial number correspond, when cross-referenced against pre-1700 architectural records, to spaces that were once publicly accessible and economically functional. The most thorough documentation of this correspondence was conducted by a team of Italian architectural historians working in the Veneto region between 1992 and 2007. They matched sealed spaces in 14 major civic buildings against surviving notarial records from the same buildings, and found that in 9 of the 14 cases, the sealed spaces corresponded precisely to rooms recorded in pre-1650 notarial documents as public measure rooms, witness chambers, or open trading galleries. In the remaining 5 cases, the records were insufficient to make a determination. In none of the 14 cases did the current building administration have a recorded explanation for when or why the spaces had been sealed. The Italian team concluded that they were looking at the physical residue of the enclosure of public economic space, and that the enclosure had been conducted without formal record precisely because formal record would have created a legal vulnerability. What has no record cannot be legally challenged. What is sealed rather than destroyed remains available to whoever controls the access. The buildings are thus both the evidence of a transformation and the ongoing instrument of it. This is what makes the sealed entrance different from a mere historical curiosity. It is not a relic, it is an active condition. The space behind that bricked doorway in Padua is not historical. It is present. The function it once served has not been replaced by something better. It has been replaced by something private. And the privatization was achieved not by law or force, but by the incremental manipulation of physical access in buildings that most people never look at closely enough to notice. Walk through any old city centre in Europe. Look at the ground floors of the oldest public buildings. Look for the places where the stonework changes colour or texture. Look for the door frames that have no doors. Look for the windows at ground level that have been filled in with brick that does not quite match the surrounding wall. Those discontinuities are not accidental. They are the trace of a process that restructured the economic life of European cities across 2 centuries. And the only record that process left in many cases is in the stone itself. The institutions that benefited from that process still exist. Some of them are among the most powerful financial entities in the world today. They did not begin in the way their official histories describe. They began in rooms that are now sealed, conducting transactions that were once public and have since been made private, exercising control over measurement standards and price records that once belonged to everyone and now belong to no one in particular, because the original owners simply forgot to keep asking for the key. The door in Padua is still there. The bricks are still newer than the surrounding stone. The city has no record of why it was sealed, and nobody in authority has asked. That is the only conspiracy you need.